In May 1536, inside of the Tower of London, a Queen of England was imprisoned, alongside suspected murderers, traitors, and those awaiting their date with the executioner upon Tower Hill. Anne Boleyn was the second wife of King Henry VIII, and she would be imprisoned as she would find herself accused of a number of scandalous charges which would ruin her reputation. She was not a popular woman at all, and many across England saw her as a homewrecker who had forced out the popular first wife of King Henry VIII, Catherine of Aragon. But Anne would be stuck in the royal apartments, a prisoner of her husband, and she was waited on by a number of ladies appointed to serve her, or more like spy on her. As the king and his adviser Cromwell needed information from Anne to use against her in evidence, she would speak of minor flirtations with men at court, and these were spun into full-blown affairs. But the trial of Anne Boleyn is considered one of the biggest miscarriages of justice and shams in English history. But what is the story of this? The women appointed to serve Anne had been ordered to write everything down, as anything could be turned into evidence for the court to condemn her. But what is most telling is that Henry VIII had, weeks before Anne would be brought to the courtroom, spoken to French officials to ask for their leading executioner, known as the Swordsman of Calais, to come to England to execute his wife. Henry VIII carefully plotted the downfall and demise of his wife, and by summoning the executioner, even before Anne's trial, it shows us what Henry had planned. He didn't regard the decision of the court, and this was just a formality, as he would know she was going to be executed. The trial of Queen Anne Boleyn would begin on the 15th of May 1536, and this took place inside of the King's Great Hall, inside the Tower of London. But this was close to Anne's quarters, and there's no doubt that in the days before that she would have heard the construction relating to this occurring, as a stadium-style seating was made in the Great Hall. This meant that 2,000 people were allowed to come and see the trial of Anne Boleyn. A large platform had also been made in the middle of the hall for Anne to stand on, and the man in charge of the proceedings would be her uncle, Thomas Howard, the Duke of Norfolk, who sat in a throne-style chair at the end of the room. As the minutes before the trial came around, many people filed into the hall and took their seats. But this was not a fair trial. It was more like these men had come to witness bear-baiting. Anne was a woman and was not allowed a defence, and she was then allowed to enter the room, and this was a shocking moment for the Queen of England, who had been anointed by God, being brought into the Tower of London's Great Hall for her trial. Reports stated that she wore a black velvet gown with a scarlet damask petticoat and an elaborate feather cap when she came into the room, and some accounts claimed she walked into the trumps as if she was triumphant, and she held her head high and even curtsied to the judges. She was not scared, and it's likely she may have also been rather naive, as she probably believed she would be sent to a convent, and she did not know that her husband had already summoned her executioner and that he was actually on his way. The indictment was read out against her, and it was said Anne, depising her marriage and entertaining malice against the king, and following daily her frail and carnal lust. According to the indictment, she found out that she was accused of seducing 5 men, and she was accused of adultery, treason, and plotting the king's death, and also incest with her brother George, who would be later tried after her. It was said that on the 6th of October at the Palace of Westminster, and on various other days before and after, by sweet words, kissings, touchings, and other illicit means, she did procure and incite Henry Norris, a gentleman of the Privy Chamber of our Lord the King, to violate and carnally know her, by reasons whereof the same Henry Norris, on the 12th of October, violated, stained, and carnally knew her. She was accused of sleeping with Henry Norris on the 12th and 19th of November 1533, Sir William Brereton on the 16th and 27th of November, and also 2 dates in December, Sir Francis Weston in May and June of 1534, and Mark Smeaton also in the May of 1534. But shockingly, She was also accused of committing incest with her brother George Boleyn in the November and December of 1535. She was accused of 20 acts of adultery, and it was said with her relations with George that Anne tempted her brother with her tongue in said George's mouth, and the said George's tongue in hers. Innocent actions, as giving courtiers money and dancing with her brother, were used as evidence against her, and she did not stand a chance. Anne had alibis for 12 of these occasions and liaisons, but this did not matter at all to the male council. The 5 men, apart from Norris, were also charged with sodomy, but to each charge she pleaded not guilty against it. The jury had already been instructed to find her guilty and sentence her to death. Anne Boleyn was then also stripped of her titles and her crown and status as the Queen, and she was known as a mere lady. And then after everything was heard, the Duke of Norfolk, her uncle, delivered the final sentence. Anne, when she heard this, had tears rolling down her face, and her uncle stated, "Because thou hast offended against our sovereign the King's grace in committing treason against his person, and here attained of the same, the law of the realm is this, that thou hast deserved death, and thou judgment is 'tis, that thou shalt be burnt here, within the Tower of London on the green, else to have the head smitten off, as the King's pleasure shall be further known of the same." A witness of the proceedings inside of the courtroom stated, "And afterwards, Monday 15th of May, Queen Anne comes to the bar before the Lord High Steward in the Tower, in the custody of Sir William Kingston, pleads not guilty, and puts herself on her peers, whereupon the Duke of Suffolk, Marquess of Exeter, and other peers are charged by the High Steward to say the truth, and being examined from the lowest peer to the highest, each of them severally saith that she is guilty. Judgment to be taken to prison in the Tower, and then at the King's command to the green within the Tower, and there to be burned or beheaded, as shall please the King." At the time, burning at the stake was the standard sentence for a woman sentenced to death for treason, but beheading was said to have been the more merciful and better way to die of the two. Anne knew she was going to die, but interestingly, the Earl of Northumberland collapsed in the courtroom when he heard the sentence read out, and he was carried from the hall, and another woman cried out and screamed in horror. The people realised that Anne would be killed. After the sentence was read out, Anne addressed the court and said, "My lords, I will not say your sentence is unjust, nor presume that my reasons can prevail against your convictions. I am willing to believe that you have sufficient reasons for what you have done, but then they must be other than those which have been produced in court, for I am clear of all the offences which you then laid to my charge. I have ever been a faithful wife to the King, though I do not say I have always shown him that humility which is goodness to me, and the honours to which he raised me merited. I confess I have had jealous fancies and suspicions of him, which I had not discretion enough and wisdom to conceal at all times, but God knows, and is my witness, that I have not sinned against him in any other way. Think not I say this in the hope to prolong my life, for he who saveth me from death have taught me how to die, and he will strengthen my faith. Think not, however, that I am so bewildered in my mind as not to lay the honour of my chastity to heart now in mine extremity, when I have maintained it all my life long, much as ever queen did. I know these my last words will avail me nothing but for the justification of my chastity and honour, and for my brother and those others who are unjustly condemned, I would willingly suffer many deaths to deliver them. But since I see it so please the King, I shall willingly accompany them in death, with this assurance that I shall lend an endless life with them in peace and joy, where I pray to God for the King and for you all, my lords." As mentioned, her brother George, after she was escorted out of the hall, was brought in, and also condemned to die, and he managed to defend himself well, but he was also condemned to death. It would be a matter of days before Anne's execution was carried out, and she would have heard in her final days the sounds of the execution scaffold being made on the north side of the White Tower, next to the chapel, where she would be carried in after her head was struck off. Interestingly, Anne is still buried inside of the Tower's chapel to this day, and she would, following the start of her imprisonment, never leave the Tower, and still, around 500 years later, she is laid to rest there. Thank you for watching, and to support, please subscribe to Her Remarkable History. Thank you.